My name is Maya Foster. I am 30 years old. The night my dad slammed a manila folder down in front of my plate and told me to sign away my share of my mother's company. The pot roast was still steaming in the middle of the table, and my older sister was swirling red wine like this was just another Sunday dinner. It's just paperwork, my dad said, jaw-tight eyes on the pen instead of on me. Jordan is the one actually running things. Be a team player for once. My mom stared at the mashed potatoes like they might answer for her, and Jordan leaned back in her chair with that lazy, practiced smile that always meant she was already sure she'd won. Before I tell you what I slid across the table instead of my signature, and who was waiting in a black sedan at the curb on our quiet block in Richmond, I want to talk straight to you. If you're watching this, tell me in the comments where you're from, and if you've ever sat through a dinner where you suddenly realized you were the only one on the menu. My dad tapped the pen against the folder, slow and sharp, like he was keeping time for a song only he could hear. You do realize, he said, that without us keeping Bright Steps afloat, you'd have nothing. Your mother's work would be gone. Jordan put in the hours you disappeared to your little spreadsheets. I felt my cheeks heat not from shame, but from the quiet, steady anger I'd been carrying for years. My mom finally looked up, eyes glossy. Honey, this is just formalizing what's already true. Your sister's the face of the company. You never wanted that responsibility. Across from me, Jordan's husband Eli rested his arm casually along the back of her chair, his watch catching the dining room light. It's fair, Maya, he added. You're not even involved day to day. I slid my hand under the table, fingers brushing the thick envelope I'd brought in my tote bag. Through the front window, I could see headlights wash over the driveway and pause. To explain why those headlights made my stomach flip for all the right reasons, I need to take you back to when I was 10, and the house I lived in wasn't mine yet, but my life already was. I still remember the smell from that day. More than anything, wet leaves, car exhaust, the sharp tang of the lilies someone thought would make death smell better. When my mother's car hit a guardrail on I-64 coming back into Richmond and went over, it didn't feel real at first. People said the words so gently that my brain kept slipping off them. She didn't make it. Instant. At least she didn't suffer. My father, the man I'd called my dad back then, whose last name wasn't Foster, and whose face I can still barely remember without looking at old pictures, died with her. At the funeral, I wore a black dress my aunt picked, because it's what people expect, and I stood between my mother's older sister and her husband, while the pastor talked about faith and plans and how God doesn't make mistakes. My aunt squeezed my hand when people came up to say they were sorry. Her husband nodded like he already had somewhere else to be. Afterward, when the casserole dishes were stacked in the sink and the house felt wrong, everyone kept repeating that phrase. You're lucky, Maya. You still have family, as if that was supposed to cancel out the fact that my actual family had just been lowered into the ground. A few weeks later, I moved into the two-story brick house on the west side of Richmond, the one with the wide front porch and the crepe myrtles lining the walk. On paper, my guardians were my mom's sister and her husband, but in real life, everyone immediately started calling them my mom and my dad, and I was expected to do the same. They had one daughter already, my big sister Jordan, who was 3 years older and seemed to glow from some internal spotlight I didn't have. She had a room full of trophies from travel soccer, framed honor roll certificates, and a bulletin board crowded with photos of smiling friends. At first, things felt almost normal. We took matching Christmas card photos in front of the fireplace. My new dad taught both of us how to ride bikes around the cul-de-sac. My new mom braided our hair before school pictures and wrote our names on brown paper lunch bags in the same careful cursive. I told myself that the hollow feeling in my chest was just grief, and that if I tried hard enough, I could make this version of family fit without noticing where it rubbed my skin raw. It didn't happen all at once, the shift. It was more like a series of tiny edits to a script I hadn't realized I was in. At 11, Jordan got a brand new silver sedan for her 16th birthday party balloons, tied to the side mirrors, neighbors clapping in the driveway while my dad made a toast about her bright future. At the same party, I was handed a used tablet with a cracked corner and told not to drop it because money doesn't grow on trees, kiddo. When Jordan needed extra money for a soccer camp in Florida, my parents opened a new credit card just for her achievements. And when I asked about joining a coding club at school, my mom said we had to be practical and that some kids are stars and some kids are support staff. One year, my 14th birthday landed during Jordan's state tournament. We drove 4 hours to watch her play. No one mentioned that it was my day. I ate a stale cupcake from a gas station vending machine in the motel room that night, sang happy birthday to myself in a whisper, and cleaned up the crumbs before they got back, so I wouldn't have to explain why I looked like I'd been crying. The winter I turned 15, I went downstairs for water after midnight and heard my parents' voices floating from the kitchen. The house was mostly dark, but there was a slice of light under the door, and the low murmur of what I first thought was another argument about bills. I stopped when I heard my name. Look, my dad was saying, his voice dropping into that clipped tone he used with rude clients. Between the Bright Step centers and the insurance settlement we're sitting on just under $2 million that's supposed to belong to Maya. He put an edge on the word belong, like it tasted wrong. As long as she's under our roof, we control every decision. The operating agreement gives us full management authority until she's 18. My mom sighed a tired sound. I just don't want Jordan to feel shortchanged. She's the one actually front-facing, putting her name on the line, building the brand. It's only fair we use some of that money to support her. My dad snorted. We've already funneled more than enough into her law school, and nobody is checking the distribution breakdowns. As long as we keep paying Maya's public school fees and feeding her, nobody's going to cry exploitation. My fingers loosened on the glass I was holding. It slipped and shattered on the hardwood. The conversation died. A second later, the door flew open and my dad stood there in the light, his shadow thrown long behind him. Go back to bed, he said, not yelling, which somehow made it worse. And watch where you're going. You're not made of money. After that night, something in me rearranged itself. I had always felt less important than Jordan, but hearing my life reduced to account balances and operating agreements made it feel official, like I was a line item on a budget instead of a daughter. Sleep got harder. Every creak in the hallway made me sit up, listening for my door, the soft click that meant they were making sure I was still there, still an asset. I started noticing things I'd ignored before: my mom's new leather tote that matched Jordan's, both paid for with company cards. The way my dad referred to Bright Steps as our business in front of friends, but your mother's mess when he thought no one else was listening. I knew Bright Steps had been my mother's passion, small early learning centers built around a curriculum she'd designed with bright murals and low shelves, and a focus on kids who weren't thriving in traditional preschools. I realized I had no idea what she'd actually set up for me, only that my parents were using it to fund a life I wasn't really part of. The anger sat under my skin like a low-grade fever, but I was 15 with no money and no proof. So I did the only thing that made sense: I started looking. It was almost a year later, right before Christmas, when I found the box. My mom always made a big production out of winter cleaning, which somehow meant I was the one crawling into the back of closets while everyone else watched movies. I was emptying the top shelf of the hall linen closet, old comforters, a broken humidifier, a stack of faded towels, when my fingers brushed against cool metal in the far corner. It was a small fireproof safe, the portable kind, with a handle heavier than it looked. Taped across the lid was a strip of masking tape I had to squint to read. The handwriting was unmistakable, even in faded blue ink. For Maya, when you are 17. Love, Mom. My knees went weak enough that I had to sit down right there on the hallway carpet. My mother had been dead for 6 years, and yet here she was, bossing me around with a line of scrawled instructions. I carried the box to my room like it was full of explosives. The lock was basic, a cheap key lock, so I used a video tutorial and a hairpin heart racing in my ears until I heard the soft click that might as well have been a gunshot. Inside was a single thick envelope sealed with red wax and a folded business card tucked beside it. I recognized the logo on the card from old paperwork in my mother's office, downtown Bright Steps Learning, but underneath that, a different name. Natalia Ruiz, attorney at law. On the inside of the lid, another strip of tape held a plastic bag with what looked like a single strand of dark hair. My hands shook as I broke the wax seal on the envelope and unfolded the pages. The letter was dated 3 months before the accident. My sweetest Maya, it began. If you're reading this, it means I'm not there to answer your questions in person, and you're old enough to hear the truth. She explained more in 3 pages than anyone had offered me in 6 years. Before she married the man, I grew up calling my dad she'd been in a brief, serious relationship with someone named Darren Pike. They were young. It ended messy. She found out she was pregnant with me after he was already engaged to someone else. She never told him not wanting to blow up his life or mine. Instead, she married the man I knew as my father who loved me from the start and agreed to raise me as his own. The part that made me set the letter down and walk around my room twice before I could keep reading wasn't that revelation, though. It was the section about money. My mother laid out in plain terms that the Bright Steps centers and the curriculum she had created were worth more than either of us had expected when she first started. Years of careful planning, a buy-sell agreement with her partners, and an insurance policy her accountant had pushed her into meant that if anything happened to her, her equity and the payout from the business interruption coverage would roll into a holding company with me listed as the sole beneficial owner. My guardians, my mom's sister and her husband, were named as managers until I turned 18. They can take reasonable fees for handling things my mother had written, but the majority of the profits and all of the equity are meant for your education and your future. I've asked Natalia Ruiz to watch the filings and make sure nobody takes advantage of you. Her card should be in this box. There's also a strand of my hair if you ever need proof of who your biological father is. You are not an obligation, Maya. You are the best thing I ever did. I realized my face was wet only when a tear landed on the paper and smudged her signature. The next day after school, I told my parents I was meeting a friend to work on a project and instead took the bus downtown to the main library. It felt safer to use a public computer than one on our home network. I typed the email address from the card 3 times before my hand stopped shaking enough to hit send. I used a throwaway account and a fake name in the subject line, but in the body, I wrote the truth that I was my mother's daughter, that I'd found the letter and the box, and that I didn't know who to trust. I expected to wait days. Natalia wrote back in less than half an hour. If you are who I think you are, she wrote, please call me from a number that doesn't belong to your household. I walked to a gas station, fed quarters into a cracked payphone I'd never noticed before, and dialed. Natalia's voice was calm and surprisingly gentle. She didn't sound shocked. She already knew that filings for Bright Steps had changed after my mother's death, that my guardians had restructured things in ways that benefited them and Jordan more than me. I've been watching the distribution ratios, she said, but I needed you to come of age before I could push anything. If you're ready, we can start gathering proof. Proof, as it turned out, looked a lot like my dad's hairbrush. Natalia explained that before she dropped any bombs, she wanted to know for certain whether the man on my birth certificate was my biological father or whether my mother's letter about Darren was the full story. That information mattered for legal reasons, but she also didn't sugarcoat the emotional angle. You deserve to know who you came from, she said, even if you already know who raised you. She arranged for a private lab to send me a kit in a plain padded envelope. A week later, when my dad left his brush on the bathroom counter after shaving, I plucked a few strands gently from the bristles, sealed them in the little vial, and mailed it from a drop box across town. It took 3 weeks. 3 long, jittery weeks where I jumped every time the mail slot clanged. The results came to Natalia's office, and she called me to come in after school. Sitting across from her conference table, my knees bouncing, I watched her slide the report toward me. Probability of paternity 0%, it read next to my dad's name. The second page listed another name, Darren Pike, with a probability so close to certain it might as well have been carved in stone. I felt like the floor had tilted, but amid the nausea was something else, a strange, wild hope that there was someone out there who might claim me not as a responsibility, but as his own. A week after that meeting, Natalia told me she'd tracked down Darren. He owned a logistics company based just outside Richmond and sat on a couple of nonprofit boards. He had no idea you existed, she said. When I sent him your mother's letter and the test, he cried on the phone. That night, I got an email from an address with his name in it. 4 words: I am so sorry. We started slow. At first, it was one message a week. More questions from him than anything else. What did I like to read? How was school? Did I remember anything specific about my mom that wasn't in the court files? He never asked for photos until I offered. When I finally sent him a picture of me holding the metal box in my bedroom, he replied with a voice note. His voice shook when he said my name. He told me about meeting my mother back when they were both interns at a consulting firm, about late nights, arguing over takeout, about how she loved jazz and loathed horror movies. I should have been there, he said. I can't fix what I missed, but I want to show up now if you'll let me. I listened to that message 3 times in a row, and then once more with my best friend Cassidy sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor beside me, passing a bag of pretzels back and forth, like we were watching a movie we didn't know the ending to. Cassidy had been my safe place since middle school, the only person who never seemed impressed by Jordan's trophies or my parents' careful image. When I showed her the letter, the test results, and the early emails from Darren, she didn't say, "I told you so," or ask for more drama than I could give. She hugged me so hard my ribs creaked, and then helped me make a list of questions for Natalia. If they've been stealing from you, there has to be a way to make them stop, she said, chewing on the cap of her pen. Natalia agreed. Over the next few months, she walked me through what we were really dealing with, because my mother's will and the Bright Steps operating agreement put my guardians in charge of the company until I turned 18. They had legal room to pay themselves reasonable management fees. But what they'd actually done, funneling distributions into Jordan's private university tuition, her destination wedding, the down payment on the townhouse she and Eli loved to brag about, went far beyond reasonable. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars diverted from you without consent, Natalia said, sliding a spreadsheet across the table, rows of numbers I could barely process. In Virginia, she explained, there were options. Once I hit 17, I could petition the court to remove them as my guardians for breaching their duties and ask for a financial accounting. We just needed the right moment, enough evidence, and one more thing, Darren's formal involvement. By the time I turned 17, my relationship with Darren felt less like emailing a stranger and more like catching up with a relative who'd been out of town for too long. We'd moved from messages to phone calls, then to occasional video chats, where I tried not to stare too hard at the ways our faces matched. He never pushed. When I called him Darren, he didn't correct me. When I asked about his family, he said he'd divorced years ago and had no other kids. That probably makes me overbearing, he joked. I have to keep reminding myself you have a life beyond my screen. Behind the scenes, he and Natalia were working together. She had him sign on as my proposed new guardian, and as a party to the corporate suit, we would file against my parents. They built a case around self-dealing, breached fiduciary duties, and misappropriated distributions. It was all very technical until they pulled it back into plain language for me. They took what your mother built for you, Natalia said, and spent it on themselves. We planned everything down to the day. Virginia law allowed a 17-year-old to petition for a change in guardianship with good cause. Natalia filed the initial motions under seal to keep my parents from seeing them too early. The court set a hearing date. Darren booked a flight. and I counted down the days with a combination of terror and relief, like someone sitting on a lifeboat waiting for the storm to either capsize or finally pass. The night everything came to a head was the same Sunday dinner I started with. The morning of my 17th birthday passed quietly. No balloons, no happy birthday banner like Jordan used to get. My mom reminded me to pick up extra salad mix because we were having a nice family meal to celebrate Jordan's promotion, and when I pointed out the date, she blinked like she'd genuinely forgotten. Well, we'll make it a joint thing, she said. You don't even like attention. Jordan breezed in around 4, sun-kissed from a weekend in Virginia Beach, with Eli waving her left hand so the new diamond earrings my parents had given her caught the light. At dinner, my dad carved the roast poured wine for everyone but me and waited until plates were full before pulling out the folder. This is straightforward, he said, flipping it open so I could see the top page. A simple transfer of your membership interest in the Bright Steps Holding Company to Jordan. You keep your last name and a small stipend, she gets control, so she can go after that regional expansion without investors asking questions. My stomach clenched. So I lose my equity, I said. In my mother's company? My mom frowned like I was being dramatic. Language like that is why we didn't want to involve you in the business. You don't understand how these things work. Instead of answering, I reached into my bag and pulled out the thick envelope Natalia had given me the day before. You're right, I said. For a long time, I didn't understand. So I asked someone who does. I pushed the envelope across the table toward my dad. He looked annoyed, then curious, then uneasy, as he stripped it open. Inside was a stack of documents thicker than the one he'd tried to hand me my petition to remove them as guardians detailed schedules of every distribution Bright Steps had made in the last 6 years, and a draft complaint accusing them of breaching both their legal and moral duties. The top sheet was an emergency court order signed 2 days earlier, appointing Darren as my temporary guardian pending a full hearing. My dad's face went gray as he scanned the signature line. This is a joke, he muttered. You went to a lawyer. You went to that vulture, Natalia. My mom snatched a page, eyes racing over the text. You can't do this in our house. My sister laughed once sharp. Maya, what do you think you're going to accomplish? You don't have the money to fight us. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. 3 short chimes, firm and even. I stood. Actually, I said, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, I'm not the one who has to fight anymore. When I opened the door, the humid Richmond air hit me first, smelling like cut grass and the faint diesel from the main road. Parked at the curb was a dark sedan I recognized from a photo Darren had sent months earlier, and beside it, framed by the porch light, stood the man whose voice I'd listened to in so many late-night messages. Darren wore a navy suit with no tie, his hair a little messier than in his corporate headshots. His eyes locked on mine with a mix of nerves and something like fierce pride. Beside him stood Natalia in a charcoal blazer, a leather briefcase in one hand, and a thin smile on her face that said she'd been waiting for this. Behind them on the sidewalk, 2 more figures, Mr. Wilkes, the family accountant my parents always talked about like he was a necessary nuisance, and a uniformed deputy from the sheriff's civil division, whose presence made my knees feel both weak and strangely steady. Evening, Ms. Foster, Natalia said, stepping past me into the foyer after I motioned them in. In the dining room, chairs scraped and voices rose. Darren's eyes flicked over my shoulder toward the table, then back to me. Ready? He asked quietly. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and led them down the hallway, my socks whispering over the hardwood that had heard so many whispered conversations I was never meant to hear. The room went silent when we walked in. My dad half rose from his chair, the court order still in his hand, and then froze when he saw Darren. For a second, nobody moved. The deputy shifted his weight slightly, his presence filling the doorway like a reminder that this wasn't just a family squabble. Natalia set her briefcase on the buffet and opened it with a practiced click. Mr. and Mrs. Foster. She said, her voice cool but not raised. As of Friday afternoon, the Circuit Court has issued a temporary order appointing Mr. Pike as Maya's guardian and freezing any further transfers from Brightsteps' holding company that are not ordinary operating expenses. You've been served by mail, but consider this your courtesy copy. She slid duplicates of the order and the complaint onto the table. Eli stood face flushing. You can't just barge in here, he said. This is harassment. The deputy cleared his throat. Council has the authority to be here, sir, and I'm here to make sure everyone behaves like adults. Mr. Wilkes stepped forward, looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. They asked me to be here, he said quietly. There are discrepancies in the books I can't sign off on anymore. Natalia began laying out documents, distribution schedules that showed money labeled as Jordan mentoring stipend invoices for a kitchen remodel, coded as center maintenance tuition payments to a private university miles away from any Bright Steps location. With each sheet she placed on the table, my parents' carefully maintained image cracked a little more. Natalia's presentation felt surgical. She didn't yell, didn't gloat. She just walked my parents through their own paper trail line by line. Here, she said, tapping a highlighted row is a distribution of $30,000 labeled as curriculum development for Center 3. The same week you wired $30,000 to the jeweler where Jordan's wedding rings were purchased. My mom sputtered something about combining errands, but her voice trailed off when Natalia slid over the matching receipt. Here, Natalia continued, is a series of payments totaling more than $150,000 over 4 years to a university in another state, coded as professional training. The only person attending that university was your older daughter. Mr. Wilkes nodded miserably. I told them it wasn't defensible, he said, not looking at me. They said family expenses were flexible. Eli tried to argue that Jordan's success benefited the brand, that her law degree helped with contracts, that surely I'd enjoyed the stability they'd provided. Stability doesn't require siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from a minor's asset, Natalia replied. The deputy stepped forward just enough for his badge to catch the light when my dad's voice rose. If you attempt to interfere with Maya leaving tonight, the deputy said evenly, you will be removed from the premises and additional charges may follow. Let's not go there. After what felt like hours but couldn't have been more than 20 minutes, it was over. My dad slumped back into his chair, staring at the pile of documents as if sheer willpower could make the ink rearrange itself. My mom's mascara had smudged under her eyes, but I couldn't tell if she was crying for me for herself or for the lifestyle she saw slipping away. Jordan stood with her arms crossed, jaw clenched, the easy smile gone. You're really going to walk out on us? She asked, finally directing the question at me, as if the lawyers and deputy and biological father weren't in the room. After everything we've done for you, I thought about Christmases spent alone while they were at beach houses, about the gas station cupcake on my forgotten birthday, about hearing my worth measured in profit shares. You didn't do it for me, I said. You did it for the balance sheet. I picked up the small duffel I'd packed earlier and slung it over my shoulder. Darren stepped to my side but didn't touch me, waiting for my lead. Take your time, Natalia murmured. I looked at the table one last time, the half-eaten roast, the untouched green beans, the pen my dad had tried to hand me, and then turned toward the hallway. As we walked out, I heard my dad start in again about lawyers and countersuits, his threats, chasing us down the hall, but losing volume with every step. The deputy followed us onto the porch, waited until we were in the car, and gave a small nod as Darren pulled away. Living in Darren's condo downtown felt like stepping onto an alternate timeline where I'd somehow gotten to keep both my parents and a sense of safety. His place overlooked the James River, all glass and exposed brick, and shelves full of books instead of framed motivational quotes. The first night I sat on the couch clutching a mug of tea while he moved around the kitchen, clearly trying not to hover. I don't want you to feel like you're jumping from one controlling situation into another, he said, leaning against the counter. You get privacy here. You get choices. I'm not trying to replace what you lost, but I'd like a chance to be your dad if that's something you want eventually. The word dad caught somewhere between my chest and my throat. I don't know what I want, yet I admitted. But I know I don't want to go back there. Over the next few weeks, he kept his promise. He drove me to school but didn't ask who I was texting. He let me decorate my room how I wanted, even when I painted one wall a color that clashed with his carefully chosen rug. Some nights we ate dinner together, and he told stories about my mother teaching him how to make gumbo. Other nights, he ordered takeout and retreated to his office so I could binge shows with Cassidy over video chat. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't on probation. The legal process moved faster than anyone expected, partly because my parents' arrogance made the job easier. They'd been sloppy, assuming no one would ever question the narrative of the selfless aunt and uncle stepping up for an orphaned niece. Media caught wind of the guardianship petition just after the emergency order, but Natalia kept most details sealed, reminding me that court was where it would really matter. Still, the board of directors for Bright Steps couldn't ignore the situation. Darren had quietly bought out one of the minority partners, giving him enough of a stake to demand an internal review. That's how we ended up at the Richmond Children's Literacy Gala 3 months later, where Bright Steps was a lead sponsor and my parents were still listed on the program as founders and managing partners. The ballroom at the convention center glittered with chandeliers and rented optimism. Darren wore a tux and an expression that was equal parts businesslike and nervous. "Are you sure?" he asked before we went in. "We don't have to make any more of a scene than the court already will." I thought about every time my parents had used my silence as cover and nodded. "They made this public when they started using my mother's work as a prop," I said. "I'm just reclaiming the stage." Halfway through the evening, after the rubber chicken entrees, and before the live auction, the MC called Darren up to the stage to say a few words as the new major donor. Cameras lifted around the room like a tide. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying easily. "I'm honored to support an organization that cares about kids and learning, because those two things have changed my life in ways I'm only beginning to understand." He glanced down at our table where I sat, heart pounding, and extended a hand. "There's someone I want you to meet," he continued. "This is my daughter Maya, the majority owner of Bright Steps Learning, and the reason I'm standing here, instead of sitting on the sidelines." The word daughter hit the room like a dropped glass. At a table near the back, I saw my mom clutch at her necklace, my dad's face draining of color, Jordan's hand tightening around her champagne flute. I walked up the steps, the hem of my borrowed dress swishing against my ankles, and stood beside Darren under the stage lights. For years, he said decisions were made in her name that didn't benefit her. That's changing. Tonight isn't just about charity. It's about accountability. People turned toward my parents' table, fingers flying over their phones. I didn't have to say a word to feel the power shift. The civil and corporate trial started in early spring, in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor cleaner, just like you'd expect from a place where people's lives get rearranged with a gavel. Judge Samuel Irwin presided, his expression mostly unreadable except when someone wasted his time. Natalia had warned me that unlike TV, this wouldn't be a shouting match. It would be paperwork, testimony, and patience. She was right. On the first day, she opened with a clear, spare statement. My parents had been entrusted with managing assets intended for my future profits from my mother's company and insurance proceeds, and instead diverted more than $240,000 over 6 years to fund personal expenses for themselves and Jordan. "We will show," she said, "that this was not a series of innocent mistakes, but a pattern of self-dealing in violation of both corporate law and their duties as guardians." My parents' attorney tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, as family sharing resources and investing in the more business-oriented child. Judge Irwin held up a hand. "Save the spin for closing," he said. "Let's see the numbers." Over several days, Natalia walked the court through bank statements, tax returns, and internal emails. Mr. Wilkes had reluctantly turned over each exhibit. Another nail in the coffin of the story my parents had told themselves. When it was my turn to testify, my stomach did a slow roll as I took the stand. I wore a simple gray blazer Darren had bought but let me choose. It made me feel older than 17 in a way I needed. Natalia kept her questions straightforward. She asked about birthdays, forgotten opportunities denied because of tight finances, and how I found the box with my mother's letter. She projected cropped images of receipts above the witness stand, tuition payments, resort, bookings, jewelry store invoices, and asked me what I'd been told about money during those years. I was told there wasn't enough for me to go on the school trip, I said, pointing at a date that matched the week my parents took Jordan to the Caribbean. I was told we needed to be careful with gas. I added, looking at the line item for a luxury SUV lease in my dad's name. My parents' attorney tried to paint me as ungrateful, implying I was punishing them for not giving me everything Jordan had. "Isn't it true they gave you a home when you had no one?" he asked. I thought about how small my world had been under their roof. "They gave me a bed and meals," I answered. "My mother gave me a future. They spent that." Judge Irwin's mouth tightened at the corner, and for the first time, I let myself believe we might actually win. In the end, there wasn't much suspense. The evidence was too detailed, too consistent, and my parents' explanations too flimsy. On the final day, after brief closing arguments, Judge Irwin leaned back in his chair, took off his glasses, and looked directly at my parents. "This was not a case of confused bookkeeping," he said. "This was a pattern of using a vulnerable minor's assets for your own benefit and for the benefit of her sibling without transparency or consent. That violates your obligations as guardians and as managers of her company." Then he laid out the consequences. They were removed as my guardians, effective immediately. Darren's temporary appointment was made permanent until I turned 18. My parents were ordered to repay the full amount of misappropriated funds, plus interest, plus Natalia's fees. They were barred from holding any managerial role in Bright Steps going forward. As he banged the gavel, a strange quiet fell over me, like the silence after a storm, when you're not sure what damage you'll find yet, but you know the wind has finally stopped. The fallout in Richmond was swift. My dad had spent years building a reputation as a steady operations director at one of the local hospitals, the guy who made budgets behave and kept things running on schedule. Within a week of the judgment, the hospital's board announced that he was no longer with the organization, citing a violation of their ethics policy. My mom lost her part-time position at a private school when parents complained about someone with her track record handling student fundraising. The house in the West End subdivision, the one with the manicured lawn and the crepe myrtles, went on the market when the bank refused to refinance their mortgage. I didn't go buy, but friends sent me screenshots when the listing price dropped, then dropped again. Jordan's life cracked more slowly. Her law firm quietly pushed her out of client-facing work while they reviewed the judgment and the press it generated. Eli's real estate deals dried up once people realized he'd used my parents' access to Bright Steps' cash flow as leverage. No one wanted their investment tied to a family scandal. I didn't celebrate exactly, but there was a grim, satisfying logic in watching the same choices they'd made out of greed circle back as consequences they couldn't charm their way out of. While their world contracted, mine widened. With my parents officially out of my legal orbit, Darren and I settled into a rhythm that felt something like what I imagined a normal father-daughter relationship could be, just compressed into fewer years. He didn't try to buy my affection with extravagant gifts. Instead, he showed up. He sat with me while I filled out college applications, asked questions about what I wanted instead of telling me what made sense on paper, and listened when I talked about my mother like she was still in the room. Natalia and one of Bright Steps' senior managers, Alicia Martinez, started teaching me how to read financial statements that had once looked like a foreign language. Alicia walked me through occupancy rates and payroll, explaining how every decision showed up in the numbers. "The best revenge," she said one afternoon as we sat in a small conference room overlooking a downtown playground, "is running this place better than they ever did." I took that to heart. I ended up accepting an offer from the University of Richmond with a scholarship and a plan major in finance minor, in something that would help me understand people as well as spreadsheets, and come back to Bright Steps with enough knowledge to guard it the way my mother had intended. Cutting my parents and Jordan out of my life wasn't a single clean moment like in the courtroom. It was a series of decisions that all pointed in the same direction. The first came a few weeks after the trial when my mom called from a number I didn't recognize and left a voicemail that started with Maya honey and ended with, "We can work this out if you just drop the money part." I deleted it without calling back. Then came a long email from Jordan full of phrases like, "You have to see it from our perspective," and "We just wanted what was best for the business," followed by a paragraph about how she'd been hurt and blindsided by my public performance at the gala. She never used words like sorry or wrong. I didn't respond to that either. Months later, I got one message that sounded closer to an apology saying she hadn't realized how badly I'd been treated and that she'd pay me back when she could. It ended with a request to meet for coffee just as sisters. I closed my laptop and went for a walk instead, focusing on the feel of the sidewalk under my shoes, the way the river sounded as it rushed past the rocks. I realized I was finally starting to believe that I didn't owe them the chance to make themselves feel better. Now at 30, I look back at that dining room scene with a mix of anger and weird gratitude. I'm sitting in a small office above one of our newest Bright Step centers on the south side of Richmond, staring at enrollment numbers and expansion plans that would have made my mother laugh in disbelief. Darren and I co-chair the board now. Alicia runs operations. Natalia still handles anything complicated enough to make my head spin. We've opened centers in neighborhoods my parents once dismissed as too risky, staffed them with teachers who remind me of the ones who used to sneak me extra reading time in elementary school, and built scholarship funds so kids like me who lost too much too soon have safe places to land for a few hours a day. I graduated with my finance degree, then stuck around to get a master's partly because I liked school, and partly because every new class gave me more tools to protect the kids and families who relied on us. Sometimes, when Darren and I are sitting on his back deck watching the river slide by, he'll call me kiddo, and I'll call him dad without thinking, and we both pretend not to notice the way his eyes get shiny. I haven't seen my parents or Jordan in person since the trial. Every once in a while, a piece of news filters in whether I want it to or not. Someone mentions that my parents rent a small apartment across town now that my dad works for a warehouse, and my mom watches kids in the afternoons for cash. I hear that Jordan and Eli eventually split up, that her law career never quite recovered, that she tried to rebrand herself online as a family resilience coach, until people in the comments remembered the gala and the judgment, and refused to let her rewrite the story. I don't feel joy when I hear those things exactly, but I don't feel guilty either. They chose money over me for years. They gambled that I'd stay quiet and grateful, and they lost. My life is calmer without them in it. There are no more surprise phone calls demanding I think of the family, and no more dinners where I'm the only one not in on the script. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that blood and paperwork don't define family. Behavior does. My parents had the legal right to call themselves my mom and dad for a long time, but they treated me like a convenient afterthought attached to a pile of assets. Darren had no idea I existed until I was almost grown, but he showed up consistently without keeping score. He didn't ask me to forgive. My parents didn't push me toward reconciliation, didn't try to shape my story into something more comfortable for anyone but me. Cutting my parents and Jordan off completely wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure I never sat at another table where love was conditional on my usefulness. I could understand intellectually how fear and entitlement twisted them into the people they became without letting that understanding soften my boundaries. I am done giving them chances. They burned their last one when they tried to turn my mother's work into a piggy bank, with my name scratched off the side. So if you've stuck with me this far, here's what I want you to take away. If people show you over and over that they value what you provide more than who you are. Believe them. Don't wait for a court case or a stranger on the internet to validate your instincts. You are allowed to walk away even from the people who fed you and tucked you in and signed your permission slips if they treat you like a resource instead of a person. You don't owe anyone access to you just because they share your last name. Thanks for listening to my story. If you've ever had to cut off family to save yourself, or if you're wondering whether it's time, tell me in the comments what you'd do in my place and what family means to you now.